Hello, everybody. You're listening to Chris Hattingh, researcher at the Free Market Foundation. Thank you very much for joining me on my latest solo podcast. This week, I just wanted to do a quick podcast, a relatively short one, on The Road to Serfdom. That's the book by Friedrich von Hayek. This month marks 75 years since its publication. He wrote the book during World War II, obviously a time of great social upheaval and conflict, and the rise of socialism around the world, both in the USSR and in Nazi Germany. Now, The Road to Serfdom is, I think, one of the greatest works in liberal thought and the liberal tradition and liberalism generally. If you haven't read it yet, I would highly recommend that you read it, hopefully before the end of the month, as sort of a tribute to Hayek and what he wrote about. Now, The Road to Serfdom is Hayek's sort of, I guess we can call it a clarion call on the dangers of socialism, all the possible ways in which the state tries to control our lives. And while I say it's about socialism, I also think in maybe a broader sense, it's about the folly and the dangers of any form of state control over the individual and over individual lives. Hayek writes specifically, he gives specific examples and then ties it into the general principle of the problems that arise, the practical problems and the moral problems that arise when the state tries to guide and control the economy. Various politicians and state planners in his time and throughout history, and especially now in South Africa, they all think that they have moral goals, how they see the economy should work, what they think people should do with their money, whom they should trade with, what they should maybe invest in, with whom they can live, what they can consume, put into their bodies. All these things are different ways of the state trying to control both the economy and then by extension trying to control individuals and individuals' lives. Just from a practical sort of standpoint, and Hayek goes in depth on this, so again, I really would hope and recommend that you read his book. It's impossible for the state to control the economy from a purely pragmatic point of view, because people are so amazingly diverse and unique. Each person has his or her own goals, his or her own interests, his or her own resources, talents, skills, and abilities. And to presume that you can apply across the board of a whole society and all the people in an economy that pushing the economy in one direction will work for everyone is simply misguided. At maybe at best, you give people the benefit of the doubt and you say it's only misguided, but at worst it becomes tyrannical. Especially when a politician has a certain fervor and has populist backing. We see all around the world the rise of populist movements, and to me, both on the right and the left of the political spectrum, people and politicians are pushing for more and more state control. The left and the right have different forms of this. The right tends to, think in terms of dangers to Western civilization, etc., and that justifies state control over immigration, for example. And then the left vilifies white people as an example, and then justifies redistribution of wealth and regressive and punitive measures of justice which isn't really justice in the true sense of the word. Both the left and the right try and gain control of the political power of the state to then impose what they think is moral and the sort of the route that society should take. As I mentioned before, the state control aspect, because of people's diversity, state control is impossible. And then the only way that a government can really push an economy in one direction is through force and dictatorship. And that's a big thing that Hayek warns about, that it might start small and with sort of noble intentions, but eventually politicians and populists, they lose patience. It's obviously easy for us to think in terms of state control and socialism in the big ways. For example, as I mentioned earlier, the former Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, and maybe nowadays Venezuela, but you sort of have to break it down into more concrete examples as well. If you think of the government trying to control schools and what's taught in schools, healthcare in the form of national health insurance, property rights under threat through expropriation without compensation, freedom of speech, which is under threat from the hate speech bill, The state tries to control what we eat in the form of sugar taxes and other regulations, where they tell you that, they have deemed something is unhealthy for you, and therefore, you must use less of it, and they'll use force to punish you accordingly. Same thing with smoking. Same thing with the consumption of marijuana. All of these small ways are different iterations of politicians trying to dictate to us how we can live, just because they've deemed, their goals as moral. They think that they can impose that on other people. And these are all small examples of central planning. I think Hayek also tries to make the point that it's a general procession, and it's sort of progress towards tyranny. It's not all going to come in one fell swoop as such. It might not come overnight, but it's in small steps that that tyranny becomes imposed on us. So we need to forever remain vigilant. The fact that it's been 75 years since the publication of The Road to Serfdom, and I'm talking about it now, and these various ways of the state trying to control us now in 2019 just shows you the fragility of individual liberty, how it's always under threat. There will always be people who try and control the apparatus of the state to mold society into the vision that they think is moral. Everyone has a vision for utopia, but usually the road to utopia is paved with blood and bones, and certain people always have to be sacrificed to attain that goal. So we always need to be on the lookout for it. We cannot take liberty for granted in any way. That's part of why I work at the Free Market Foundation, and why I think it's so important to write about and talk about these things. I don't think it's a matter of hysteria or anything like that. You need to keep politicians and the state honest, accountable, and you need to raise red flags when they try and control your rights and your liberties. So thank you again for listening to my podcast this week. I really hope that if you haven't yet, that you go and read The Road to Serfdom by Hayek, that you think about what he says in his time, and think about how you can apply those principles to governments and societies nowadays, and how governments are trying to control and take away our liberty. Thank you for listening, and I'll talk to you next week. Bye.